This show has been brought to you by the Thomas Allen Collection. The Thomas Allen Collection is a men's accessory line designed to attract and capture a variety of tastes with a unique appeal. Thomas Allen strives to produce an extraordinary design to turn a new leaf on fashion for men and at desired occasions. If I told you once, I told you several times on this podcast, ladies, get your men a Thomas Allen Collection tie. They'll love it. Gentlemen, get you a Thomas Allen Collection tie. You can't go wrong with rocking a Thomas Allen Collection tie at a formal event. BG, don't you own a Thomas Allen Collection tie?
Yes, sir. And they way fly than anything that's already out there. I got a couple of them, so I recommend going out there and getting some of that flavor.
Yep, Thomas Allen Collection. You can reach him at 678-960-9171. 678-960-9171. Thomas Allen, when tying a knot really counts.
And brought to you by the Selma Project, an initiative created to infuse hope and inspiration into the youth of Selma, Alabama through culture, art, and entertainment. This initiative calls on friends of the Selma movement to use their gifts and talents to pave a road to success for future generations. Check them out, selmaproject.com. And brought to you by faithful listeners everywhere. And now to the show. Welcome to the New South Movement.
Ladies and gentlemen, a classic.
Bismillah. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gon' come. Yeah, I chose the path chose me. This a Lord's plan, divine decree. Natural high, window sheet, up a parallel view, let the ghetto see. BK, NOLA, OMF, GLD, Amazing Grace.
Welcome to the FreeLunch Podcast, home of the New South Movement. This is your boy Tight, one half of the FreeLunch Podcast, and I have my co-host with me, BG. BG, how are you today?
I'm blessed, man. Everything's going well. We have another one of those interviews.
Oh, I'm extremely excited, BG, and the reason I'm extremely excited is because today's guest has done something that's near and dear to my heart. And as you know, back in 2000, I kind of started introducing you to this story. But essentially, today's guest is going to be able to share with us a lot around the last slave ship, the last known slave ship to actually come into the Americas, known as the Clotilda. We'll be able to kind of talk about the people that were on that ship, where they were from. We'll be able to also talk about the captain and the captain of the ship, and just some other really, really important stuff, not only to American history, but really important to my history because I'm a direct descendant of that slave ship, the Clotilda.
And, you know, in speaking with that, it's close to home. And what we'll see in this story, that it's positioned right here in the state of Alabama. So as much as it's close to you, it's close to me for a lot of different reasons. Of course, because you've shared the story with me before, but a lot of these things happen right down the road, and there are a lot of intersecting points. And so, and with this history tone to it, you know, I'm really tied in and connected to this interview and to this profound figure that we have that's joining us today. So let's get to it, man.
But I kind of want to set the stage just to give everyone a sense of the direction we're going to take this interview. So I remember growing up, and my grandmother, who really told me a lot about this particular story, she introduced me to the Clotilda, Africa Town, and some of the other terms and protagonists that are going to be told in today's interview and story. But it really didn't hit home for me until right when I got to college around 1999 or 2000, because my grandmother, it started to just make sense, the places she would take us. I remember growing up in a church called Union Baptist, and we may even mention that today during today's conversation. But I attended Union Baptist. I would attend different summer programs at Union Baptist, Vacation Bible School, etc. I even remember growing up, BG, and being in a parade, a Mardi Gras, that kind of celebrated some of the things that we're going to talk about today. But I was so young that I didn't even understand what it was I was doing. It wasn't until I got to college where my grandmother, she was getting really old, and she started spilling in me a lot of the narrative around what we're going to talk about today. She passed in 2001, and before she passed, and after we had kind of talked about today's story, I wanted to kind of honor her, not only in telling this story, but keeping this story alive, simply because of how much it meant to her and how much it meant to me. So that's kind of the background and kind of some of the history as to the role that I play in this particular story. But I really want to leave it to our special guest to kind of educate today's audience on this story and why it's so significant in American history. So, BG, if you don't mind introducing our guest today.
I have no problem doing that. So our special guest today is an award-winning author and well-known historian of the African diaspora. As we've seen in our research that we did in preparing for this interview, she spent a great portion of her life studying and researching and writing about the dynamics that are encompassed in the experiences of African peoples all around the world, with books that include Slavery's Exiles, the story of American Maroons, and Servants of Allah, African Muslims enslaved in the Americas, and the book that we'll be featuring today, Dreams of Africa in Alabama, the slave ship Clotilda and the story of the last Africans brought to America. It's very clear that our guest has made it a point to educate the world on pieces of history that usually go unheard or forgotten. A lot of things in this story that we should know, we really don't have any idea of. So we're extremely thankful for the work that she's done. She's a native of France, and she's currently the director of the Lapidus Center for Historical Analysis of the Transatlantic Slavery, and is the curator for the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And among all of that, she has won numerous awards. And this March of this year, she was able to address the United Nations General Assembly, speaking about the transatlantic slave and the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. So to our FreeLunch Podcast family, we would like to welcome Dr. Sylviane Diouf.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to first start off and just say thank you for the time and the research you put into learning about this story and sharing this story with the masses. I'm from Mobile and living around Plateau and Africa Town. A lot of the history and a lot of the just within our community in general isn't told. Luckily, I had a grandmother that wanted to share as much as she could with me, but that's not the case in a lot of stories. I guess the first question I have for you is, how did you hear about this particular story, and what motivated you to kind of write about the Clotilda and the slaves that were on that ship?
Well, I've been working on slavery and the slave trade and the African diaspora, I think forever. My dissertation many years ago was actually on slave resistance and revolt. So this is really my area of interest. And several years ago, I was doing research for my book, Servants of Allah, African Muslims Enslaved in the Americas, and I was looking for any primary sources on Africans in the Americas. And I found this book, Historical Sketches of the South, written by Emma Langdon Roche, who is from Mobile. And the book was published in 1913 or 1914. And she recounted the story of the people who were on the Clotilda, and she had interviewed them. She had pictures. She had taken photographs. She had sketched them. And I thought it was very interesting, but it didn't fit into the book that I was writing about at that time. So I kept this idea, kind of at the back of my head. And then several years later, I thought, okay, let me go back to that story. And there I discovered that a few historians who had very superficially, I would say, looked into it, said, it had never happened, it was a big hoax, etc. And I thought, no, this story is real. And I decided to do research on it because I thought it was fascinating. And when you look for something, you may actually find it. So I did a lot of research in the archives in Mobile, in Washington, D.C., the National Archives, several other places, and I did also research in Benin. And I found a multitude of documents. And so that's how I started to write about this story.
It's really fascinating because, things as simple as the spelling of the actual slave ship was interesting to me, where some names spell it with an E and others spell it with an A. Is there a proper way for the actual spelling of?
Well, yes, because in my book, for example, there's I took the photograph of the actual document that the official document which was done when the ship was actually built, and so the document has the name of the ship as the Clotilda. So that's what it is.
I do encourage everyone to go out and purchase the book. It's available on Amazon. I've purchased the book. It's called Dreams of Africa and Alabama, the slave ship Clotilda and the story of the last Africans brought to America. I want to do as the book does and start from the beginning. Can you kind of talk about Timothy Mayer and William Foster and set the stage for who they were as number one, immigrants, and the bet that they made prior to actually selling to get the slaves?
So Timothy Mayer was a northerner. He was originally from Maine, and his father came from Ireland, and he had migrated to Mobile at the time, in the 1830s, at the time when Mobile was really the place to be. There was a lot of trade going on. He was, he started as a, just as a sheep hand, and then, he worked his way up. He became very rich. He built boats. He had a sawmill. He owned land. He owned timberlands as well. He brought his brothers to work with him. And of course, he and his brothers had a number of slaves. Now, William Foster was originally from Canada. He also migrated to Mobile. Foster was a ship captain. And the story of the bet is that Timothy Mayer had bet that he could bring, as he said, a ship full of the N-word to Mobile under the nose of the authorities. Now, you have to know that the transatlantic slave trade to the United States was abolished in 1807 with the starting date of January 1st, 1808, and that was written actually in the Constitution. But the slave trades continued illegally. So every year, you had ships that arrived in the Deep South, mostly Florida, Texas, Alabama, and brought Africans in secret. It was really not really that secret because, authorities kind of knew but turned a blind eye. So in 1859, Mayer decided that he was going to do just that. Just to explain why the slave trade continued to exist illegally, the people, the planters and the farmers in the Deep South were buying people from the Upper South Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, but they thought that they were too expensive.
Right.
So it was cheaper to have an expedition go to Africa and bring illegally a number of people. So that was the story. And Mayer chose his friend William Foster as the ship captain to go on the Clotilda, which was Foster's ship, to go and bring people back to Mobile.
He purchased the ship for $35,000, which in that time it seemed like it was that was pretty expensive to purchase that particular ship.
It was most, not really the purchasing of the boat, but also turning it into a slave ship, buying, enough food and stuff, for the trip. And as well as goods to be exchanged. So that was, the whole thing that cost that much, yes.
There are a lot of things that we oftentimes underestimate or don't really take notice of when we talk about this transatlantic slave trade. This whole institution started in like the 1500s, and it ran all the way through, like we say, the 1800s. So you've got like 300 years of this being an understood and a standard practice. So I think it like for it to be assumed that with the abolishment that this way of life would just end would be hard to really even fathom, because it had just been a way of life for so many generations of the Europeans that had migrated to the country. So that just really stood out to me as something that to really take note.
Yes, well, the transatlantic slave trade started in Hispaniola, the island where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are today. It started in 1501, and the last slave ship, documented slave ship, arrived in Brazil in 1867. So the transatlantic slave trade, lasted for more than 360 years.
I have a quick question before we get into the actual when the March the 3rd date when William Foster actually sailed, because I find that even an interesting story. Can you paint the picture even a little bit more with the South and the agriculture and the role that it was playing within the United States overall during that period?
Well, the Deep South has been opened not very long before, so the cotton was really, really started in the Deep South in the 1800s, and people were brought. I think what is really important there is what people usually do not know. It's the domestic slave trade. And what happened is that, the transatlantic slave trade brought about 400,000 Africans to the United States, 400,000, as compared to Brazil, where it was almost 5 million. But the domestic slave trade brought 1.2 million people from the Upper South to the Deep South to work in the cotton plantations. So that was, a massive deportation, uprooting of African Americans and people who had been born in Africa to those areas of the South. And in Alabama, there was, a need for those workers. But there was also a need, and that was we see with Neale, for people who were enslaved working on the steamships, because there was a lot of traffic on the rivers. So I think for me the most important part really is the making of the African American population in Alabama at the time, which was actually made by people who had been uprooted from Virginia and Maryland, etc. And if you look at the census, the 1870 census, which is the first one which actually counts people, counts Black people as people, you will see, that so many were born in the deeps, in the upper South and ended up in Alabama or in Texas.
Is that what's basically portrayed in the 12 Years a Slave and Samuel Northrop story?
No, because in 12 Years a Slave, it's a kind of a different story, because Northrop was actually born in New York, and he was kidnapped in Washington D.C. and then brought to Louisiana. So his story was a little different. But there were, among the people who were uprooted, there were also those free African Americans who were sometimes kidnapped and brought to the deep South.
So you were saying how they were mainly slaves that were brought from the D.C. area versus...
From D.C., from Maryland, from North Carolina, and among them were some people who had been were also free people who had been kidnapped, but most were people who were enslaved and who had been sold, or who had been forced to follow their owners as their owners moved themselves from the upper South to the deep South.
We don't hear that story told a lot at all. I found it interesting because if you can kind of talk about William Foster, he basically set sail on March the 3rd, 1860, and it was a 2.5-month trip. But during that trip, a lot happened. Even so much so that a lot of his crew didn't even know that they were on a ship headed to the west coast of Africa. For our audience members, do you mind kind of setting the stage and telling that story as to what happened during that 2.5-month trip to West Africa?
At the time, because the slave trade was illegal, there were a lot of sailors who embarked on ships thinking that they were going to go somewhere to do some legal business, and did not know that they were going on a slave ship. That they were on a slave ship. And so there were some, rebellion from the crew. There were also, the ship was also chased. Then, there was, it got into some problems. It had to refuel, not to refuel, but, to be repaired, etc. So there was a lot of things going on during this trip to Ouida. But I think that the most interesting part is really when, who the people are, who the people were who actually then were brought to Mobile.
So basically, they ended up in West Africa, and I kind of want to get to your point. And just talk about the slaves that were chosen and how they basically were captured, because that's the point that we kind of want to talk about.
First of all, we have to, so the ship, the Clotilda, sailed to Ouida in Benin, the country which is today Benin, on the west coast. And it's there in a barracoon, that is, a slave pen, that William Foster selected 110 men, women, and children. Now, those people were coming from different areas. Some were from northern Benin, some from the kingdom of Dahomey, some came actually from Nigeria. Most of them were Yoruba speakers. But there were people from a diversity of cultures and ethnic groups and languages. And some had been captured, some were traders who had been kidnapped as they were walking, doing their, traveling for their trade. Most of them had been, a large group had been made prisoners in a raid on their town. And there were people also who had just been, individually kidnapped here and there. And, they all were then marched to Ouida. And that's where they were held, in this pen. There were young people between the ages of 5 and 23. About half of them were females and half males. Some were married and probably had children, and others were still quite young. So those, this is what happened. And then, they were sent to, one of the things that I think is important to also understand how things worked. Slave ships were big ships, they didn't come close to the beach. So people were put in small canoes that then went, to the ship, which was anchored away. And as the captives were getting onto the Clotilda, and this is one thing that happened in almost all slave ships, the clothes that they were wearing were taken from them because slave ship captains and physicians, because there were usually a doctor on board, so that it was more hygienic to have people travel naked, because their clothes would they wouldn't have been able to wash their clothes. So that was one of the things. So people traveled, went through the Middle Passage naked. And that was one of the things that the people who were on the Clotilda, once they were in Mobile, even 50 years later, they were still crying at the humiliation. So when people think about the Middle Passage, we usually think about really the horror of all this. And it was an absolutely horrific situation. But there was that as well, the humiliation.
And what makes it worse for me is that this was a two-sided trade. So, of course, you had the European side and aspect of it, but then you had King Gizo, who basically was kind of at the front line of trading the Africans that had been kidnapped or captured by means of war, and sending them across the water. So to really see that this was really business. At the end of the day, this was human lives being used as a commodity, and being a part of just this commerce exchange between the different countries of the world. So that just adds to the adversity that comes along with this whole story.
Absolutely, yes.
It was a 45-day trip back, on the Clotilda for those 110 men, women, and children that were aboard. Can you kind of talk about just that entire journey? What was that like?
Well, what I found very interesting is that the people who were on the slave ship, Polly, Kojo, Zuma, and the others, when they later on talked about, and mostly Kojo, but talked about the trip, you see how observant they were. They looked at everything. They looked at the color of the water. They looked at, and they were trying to find out what was going on. They were looking at the sky, the birds, if there were any. I mean, really, they were not just passively there. They were very keen observants of what was going on around them, trying to maybe find out a way, if they could, and that is pure speculation, but maybe to find a way, maybe to revolt or anything. I don't know. They never talked about that. But we know that at least over 500 slave revolts on board ships. have been documented, and there were probably twice as many. So we know that people were not just, passively there. If they had an opportunity, they would seize it. So what I found interesting is that I was able to compare what, for example, what Kojo was saying about the trip as they experienced it, and also what William Foster was writing about the same trip, because Foster then wrote a description of the trip from the moment he left Mobile until the time he came back. So we have those two descriptions of the middle passage, if you will, one by the slave ship captain and the other one by the captives. And this is probably, as far as I know, the only case where we have those two descriptions by the that exist, and it's fascinating. For example, at some point when Kojo explained, that something happened, and the captain was looking, with his looking glass, and at the same time we can see that Foster was encountering, was being chased, etc. So it's a very interesting story.
It is, and I want to make certain that the audience is aware who you mentioned Kojo, and I don't think that we've introduced him yet, and I'll allow you to kind of talk about him. But Kojo Lewis, he died in 1935. He was the last living descendant of the Clotilda, and he was 19 when he was captured.
What I want, to explain is that because this slave ship was the last recorded, the ship arrived and the people arrived in Mobile in July of 1860.
Right.
So they were still alive, in at the beginning of the 20th century. And Kojo Lewis, who was Yoruba and who came from Benin, died, as you mentioned, in 1935. So we have pictures of him, several. We have interviews with him. We even have a very short, not a video because at the time it didn't exist, but a very short film of him when he was 87. So, and others in the group were also interviewed at different times, in the 1890s, in the early 1910, etc. So we have a lot of documentation about what they said, what they thought, what they felt. And this is really unique. And Kojo Lewis was, because he was then, the last one, he had a very long life. As you mentioned, he arrived in Mobile when he was 19, but he died in 1935 when he was 95. So through him, and we learned really a lot.
And I wanted to make certain that the audience were aware of who, when you mentioned Kojo, and when they were on the actual passage, how the two distinct dialogues that were occurring, or the two distinct viewpoints. One was coming from an actual slave, and the other was coming from the captain of the slave ship, and that was extremely interesting to me.
In my mind, that they are able to put into words and to give us like these detailed accounts that I would imagine would be very similar to like the first group of slaves that came to America. So this is really magical to be able to put some real imagery with the story. Does a lot for us right now in this present seat when we have to take a look back to see like where our descendants, what they endured and where they came from.
Even though the people who were on the Clotilda didn't say much about what they endured, even with the little that they said, we still get a very interesting picture. And I must say that, we have other accounts of Africans who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade, but we know very little because they said very little. And this particular episode, the Middle Passage, was such an horror, was such a traumatic event. Not only, and people have to understand, it's not only the trip itself, because the conditions on slave ships were absolutely horrendous, but it's not that really that is, that was the worst. The worst was the uprooting. The worst was the separation of the families. And so we have, even though, again, the victims themselves said or wrote very little about that because it was such a terrible time, we have, and that's very important, we have description of what happened by the slave ship captains and others who were on the slave ships, and they were saying how people were singing, especially at night. They were singing, and it was such melancholy songs. And when they asked for a translation, people were singing about. They were lamenting the fact that they were separated from their families, and they were singing about that. It was never, any kind of happy song. It was really terrible songs. And they were recounting how, they went to sleep thinking, about their families, and then they woke up and they were on a slave ship. So this is all the things that happened, and that people then did not want to talk about. They did not want to talk about that to their children. They didn't want to talk about that to anybody. So we have very little in terms of what the people who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade really went through. But with the people on the Clotilda, we know a little bit.
The majority of these people are young people, ages ranging from like 15 to 30. You have women on there who were married and had children. So yeah, the pain of being separated and not being with your loved ones had to be very immense. And then not knowing where you're going and all that comes along with that just, compounds it.
They were a resilient people because the 45-day trip, they eventually made it back to the Mobile area. And when they got back, the feds or the federal government kind of found out about this particular trip, and so I'm gonna let you, Doctor, kind of tell the story.
Yes, what happened is that also, the people who were on the same ship became shipmates, and that was very important because people had lost their families, and they recreated a family, and that family was made of shipmates, the people who were, who went through that terrible time with them. So when they arrived, and that was true all over. It was not just on the Clotilda. So when the shipmates arrived in Mobile, because again, it was illegal, they arrived, at night. They were sent to another boat, etc. A very kind of cloak and dagger story there. And then they were put in secret. They were hidden in the cane brakes until Neale could actually sell them. So he kept some from him. Others were given to Foster, and others to his brothers, and the rest were sold. Some were sent to the Black Belt, further up in Alabama, and others were sold locally around Mobile. So their life, they were enslaved for 5 years because, they arrived in 1860, and then, they were freed in 1865. But during those 5 years, Some worked in the fields, others, like Kojo, worked on the ships, on the Neale brothers' ships. Others were domestics. It all depended. Then, because those were sold to the two other Neale brothers, were not in Mobile, but because the brothers were actually working together, so the groups of people who were enslaved on those different plantations could continue, to be, to meet one another, to exchange news, etc. So they kept very, very close to one another. And when slavery was finally ended, they regrouped, and they regrouped in Mobile, in northern Mobile, in Plateau. As you mentioned, they were a very resilient group of people. And the first thing, they decided to do was to actually try to return to their countries. So that was their first plan. They decided then, that they would, they all would work, men and women, and would then, pool their money together to be able to buy, a passage to their country. That unfortunately didn't work. They never made enough money to be able to do that. So they decided that the next thing was to, and that is very important. They asked Kojo to ask Miher to actually give them land. That did not happen. He refused, but it's interesting to see how they asked for reparations. You see, they said, we've worked for you, and rather for free for all those years. Before we came here, we had families, we had land, we had houses, and now we want that. And he said no. So they were not discouraged. They continued to work and putting their money together, and they started to buy land.
Dr. Diouf, this was in a short span of time to be able to gain that type of competence and that understanding enough to know what they would need to sustain themselves. What do you think put them in the position to maneuver and get to that point so fast?
Those were people who, in their prior life, in Benin or Nigeria, had been people who were, some were traders, others, were worked, in the market, people who traveled. They were used to being free. They had lived, a very independent life. They were used to see, when they were, those who were very young, they were used to see their mothers or their fathers, working in the fields for themselves, working at the market, being soldiers, whatnot. So they had been raised really, in that way, where people are independent workers. And so that's what they wanted to replicate in the place where they had ended up. And they also wanted, once, as when they realized that they were not going to not going back, so they decided to recreate Africa as much as they could where they were. So they were, by making a lot of sacrifices, they were able to, to buy land and to build, again, what they did was to pool their money together and then, give lots to whoever. And then they built their houses as a group. If Kojo needed his house built, then everybody would come and build their house with him, etc. So they continue to really live as Africans do, which means, collectively, to be very, it's not the individual, it's the collectivity in Africa that really matters. Individuality is really frowned upon, contrary to the United States. Right. So the fact that they were, such a coherent group, that really helped them, and the fact that they had grown up seeing all those things around them as normal, that was also one of the things that helped them a lot.
Yeah, I read a very interesting piece, Cujo Lewis's own story of the last African slave, and he talked about that exact same experience that you're mentioning, that whole collective and unity. In your research from the other Middle Passage stories that you've read, was this a common kind of trend where they united and worked together?
It's kind of hard to say, again, because we really have this particular example that came very late, so it's easy, to see. But, most of the Africans who arrived, whether, in the United States or in the rest of the Americas, most of them spent their entire life enslaved. So we don't know. It's just that those who arrived very late, like, in the 1860s, and for some other countries, maybe earlier, it depends when slavery was abolished. In the US, it was 65. In the British Empire, it was 1833. So it depends. But, we have an example there. I'm sure, it's happened also in other places where people, this type of collective lifestyle is present. It's very African, and we can see that also, in Maroon communities, for example.
And I kind of mentioned this earlier. But they established, like you said, their own town, basically. They had their own church that they attended. They formed their own land and helped each other out. Are there any other, during this period, significant takeaways that you think this audience would be interested in knowing about this group of people?
Yes, I think that, they created their town and they called it African Town. And that was very telling. It was where they wanted to be in Africa, but they could not, so they recreated, and that's what they said, to recreate Africa where they were. But what is interesting also is that even though, and they had their own structures, if you will, what they said was they wanted to have their own chief and their own judges, and that's what they did. Yes. So they selected one of them to be the chief of this town. They selected also judges, and they, when there was something that didn't work out, or kind of maybe a quarrel or something so they all went as a group to the judges, and then the judges decided what's to be done. And that, again, that kind of structure with a chief that people choose and with judges that they also choose is also, very a very African cultural feature. So they really tried as much as they could, to continue, to live, if you will, as much as they could have, as was possible in an African way. They also raised their children, because at some point they all had children. And some of them, those who had, some married African Americans, others married shipmates. So those, for example, who married shipmates, both would, for example, speak the same language, and they taught the language to their children. But all also gave a sense of what Africa was. I mean, and when I say Africa, what their particular areas of origin were. Saying how beautiful it was, and how plentiful, of food and fruit and trees, and the children grew up with this image of their parents' homeland as really this kind of paradise. So they were really, really, attached to their cultures. But once they had their church, they had also opened the first school in the area.
Yes.
But so they were, if you will, really also, as much as they were living as Africans, they were also very much living as Americans, taking advantage of what they could get here. But the interesting thing is that at some point at the church, a missionary came, and that missionary had lived in Nigeria, and he spoke Yoruba, and he told them that that he could help them go back, and they were ready to leave. They were ready to leave immediately, even though they had land, they had houses and everything. Once, they thought that they could go back home, that's what they wanted to do. Again, of course, we know that it didn't work out. But you can see, the attachment that they had, to their home countries and to their families.
Yep, and I mentioned that church earlier. It was formerly known as Old Baptist Church, and it's now known as Union Baptist Church, and that's actually a church that I attended, as I mentioned in the earlier part of this dialogue. I attended that church as a little boy with my grandmother, so I'm very familiar with the church. I'm very familiar with Plateau, which is the area where Africatown basically resides now, and just the history within itself. I had one more question for you, Doctor, if you don't mind. And it really was around just the popularity of this group of people. Through my readings and my research, I understand that a number of, well-known black folks during this particular time actually sought them out. You mentioned earlier how Cujo was interviewed. Can you just kind of talk about their particular popularity and some of those high-profile individuals that actually came to visit them and see them?
The title of my book is Dreams of Africa in Alabama. And the reason why I chose that title is because one of the shipmates, Osakibi, said to Booker T. Washington, said to him, I goes back to Africa every night in my dreams. So I found that absolutely, very moving and really extraordinary. Osakibi had been, in Alabama for over 40 years, and he had left his home country when he was very young, maybe 20, but still, he dreamed of Africa every night. So Booker T. Washington met with them. Another famous African-American was the anthropologist and writer Zora Neale Hurston.
Yes.
So the story here is a little bit complicated, but while she was doing her studies at Barnard College in New York, she went to Mobile and tried to see Cujo. That was in 1926. It didn't work very well. I don't know what happened, but she had she had a contract to write an article for the Journal of Negro History. And when she realized that she didn't have anything to say, so she plagiarized the book that I mentioned earlier by Emma Langdon Roche, and wrote an article that was published. Nobody realized that until after actually she had passed away. But then the following year, she went back to Mobile and she interviewed Cudjoe. And she did it very, very, very well. The manuscript has never been published, but it's at the library at Howard University. And I consulted it, I read it there. And it's very detailed, it's very precise, it's very interesting. It's about 100 pages, if I remember correctly. And so a lot of what we know about what I use in my book also comes from that manuscript. And as I mentioned, she also filmed him. So it's just a few seconds, I think it's like 40 seconds, but it's really extraordinary. And she took pictures of him, other people photographed him as well. So we have there's a good collection of photographs of him, and actually the cover of my book.
I was just about to say that the cover of your book.
Yes, I mean I found this photograph just extraordinary. It's Cudjoe Lewis sitting on a chair in front of his house with his pipe, and he is hugging his two little granddaughters. And I know that when I was doing my research, they were still alive. I don't know if they still are, but those are two little girls, Mary and Martha, and they're just it's just a wonderful photo.
I don't want to keep you too much longer, but BG, I did want to allow you to answer any more questions that you may have.
It's definitely been an honor having you on with us today and telling us, educating us on a lot of things that we didn't know, and hopefully our listeners gain something from this conversation. But for the ones that are going to go out and buy this book, what is it that you would like for them to take home?
Well, I think really, I don't know. To me, it's just a very human story. And I think that's what is missing a lot, because when we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade, we're talking about millions of people. 12.5 million Africans were deported through the transatlantic slave trade. 10.7 million arrived. So it means that more than, about 2 million died during this journey. And we look at numbers, and it's huge. And we need to understand the human story behind the numbers. And this story, actually, when I realized as I was doing this research and writing the book that it is the best documented story of the transatlantic slave trade, not only to the United States, but to the entire Americas. This is a story, again, because it happened late, at a time when people could be interviewed, when people could be photographed, because we have all that documentation that exists, and we really have also what is interesting in that story is that we have people, in the book I show them, as they were in Africa, as being free in Africa, and then during the Middle Passage, and then enslaved in Mobile, and then free in Mobile, and all the things that they did. And so you really have a sense of, how could I say that? The immense determination and courage and creativity of the people who were the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. You also have a sense of the immense waste, and horror that it was. But what I got from that story is really this extraordinary story of cultural resistance, of resilience, of determination, of dignity. And I think that when people today don't know, for the most part, who their ancestors were, and you, Mr. Ellis, you are lucky because you do know, but most other people do not know. But I think that if they want to know who their ancestors were or were like, this is the story that they should read.
Oh, it's an excellent story, and first, on behalf of my family and just on behalf of direct descendants from the Clotilda, I would like to just thank you for taking the time to actually do the research, because in a lot of ways, or I mean, in actuality, it's my history book.
Yes.
And for me, it was very revealing, and it is a sense of pride. My grandmother spoke highly of Africa Town. She was actually the president of that organization that currently exists today, and because of that, I take it as a high responsibility to kind of share this story, which is the reason for my continuous emailing you and asking you to be a part of this. So thank you for the time and for doing the research and putting this story together.
Well, and really thank you, because I think that by doing this, by your grandmother and your mother, etc., you are continuing this story, so that this story doesn't just disappear, and that this story is known. And this is your part in this long chain, of those people who arrived and made the most of what they could do here. And you are part of that chain, and you're continuing to do that at your own level. So thank you.
So the question I have, has anyone ever reached out to you as to make this a cinema or to tell this story on a larger platform?
Well, this is one thing that I know, that when the book came out, there was interest expressed on television as well as cinema, and then nothing came out of that. But I know that there is, and I'm not going to give you any detail because I don't really know where that's going, but there's a project of a documentary, perhaps being in the work. I mean, the work has not started yet, but there is this possibility of a documentary being made. So hopefully that will be done. There are things that still exist in Africa Town. The graveyard where the Africans are buried and where their children and grandchildren are, it is still there. Some of the trees that they planted, are still there as well. Some of their descendants are still in Africa Town. Others are, in other places. But this is really the time.
Yes, it is.
Yes, and I hope that it can be done.
Yep, and that's the role that we want to play. So anything that we can do to help, because I want to make certain this story is told, and I know we need to wrap up, but I just wanted to make certain that on this particular podcast, to the listeners and to anyone that listens to this particular podcast, I think it's important that you, number one, know your history, but also continue to tell the story and continue to tell the truth around the story. And so we'll continue to tell this story you have a number of books available. Can you tell anyone that's interested your website and if they wanted to purchase this book or any of your other books? Because I know we didn't go into detail on this particular book, but there's a lot of history for our listeners, for anyone that hears this podcast. There's a lot of history in this particular book and in the other books that you've written. So do you mind kind of leaving your website?
My name is a little complicated. My first name is French. My last name is Senegalese. I'm half Senegalese, half French. So I'm going to spell both names, which, as I mentioned, are two foreign names. My name is Sylviane, which is Sylviane. My last name is Diouf, Diouf, and my website is sylvianediouf.com.
BG, anything else you want to summarize and say?
Well, so for everyone that's been out there asking me for book recommendations, this is the book for you. Dreams of Africa in Alabama, the slave ship Clotilda and the story of the last Africans brought to America by Dr. Sylviane Diouf. It's available everywhere where books are sold. I got my copy off of Amazon.com. You go get yours. In the in-between time, also continue to check for us. FreeLunchPodcast.com for podcasts and blogs. Also, if you got comments, let us know what you think. Twitter, FreeLunchPodC, and we're on Instagram, FreeLunch Podcast. And be sure to look for videos on YouTube, FreeLunch TV.
This is a story that's near and dear to my heart. Like I said, I am a direct descendant of my grandmother before she passed in 2011. She shared a lot of this history with me. So just for all the listeners and anyone that is interested in knowing your history, I really recommend you go and purchase this history book. We left a lot of the details out in regards to this story, but they are definitely told within this book. So please go purchase the book. Read the story and do whatever you can to tell it to your friends and family, and let's get this story told on a cinema or a high level. So again, thank you, Dadu, for joining us today, and many blessings to you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's go, let's get it. Let's go, let it go now. Let it go, let's get it. Get it, got 'em. Let's go, let's get it. Let's go, let it go now. Let it go, let's get it. Super mathematics, not a problem. No lock for that old block. So sign away for that bull rock. Super small, handcrafted art design. No, they know not. Flow tougher than tough time. Blacker than the gram, they drum line. No overdose, I'm overwalk. I'll be away for crunch time. Yeah, wear like sunshine. I leave right cross. Punchline, I beat the track. I eat the track. Brown paper breakfast. Lunchtime, dinner date, dessert tray. Ramadan, flow hungry. You see the sign between the line. It's G's only. No dummies, I flow lovely. They go nutty. They catch a feeling. These hoes touch. Yeah, I tell that jump off. No bunch. No awakening. Home study. But you're so pretty. Best show. Sometimes the best way to touch it. Stand and go. Let's go, let's get it. Let's go, let it go now. Let it go, let's get it. Get it, got 'em. Let's go, let's get it. Let's go, let it go now. Let it go, let's get it. Mathematics, before I chose the path chose me. This is a Lord's plan, divine decree.